I will be president for all Americans.
We're covering a story that no one saw coming.
Journalism got the context wrong for why people voted in the way that they did.
Let's face it, we in many ways were on the ballot as well, the media.
The swastika in the word media.
And I myself have been the subject of very targeted harassment online.
We are naive if we think there's true freedom of expression anywhere in the world at the moment.
I'm Diana Swain. We're the investigators. This is what we do. The U.S. election campaign is finally over. That's what you're thinking, right? Well, really, it's not. The hostility, anger, and desire to blame someone for all that's wrong is still there.
It's live on CNN. Who likes CNN?
Journalists were the target of anger during the campaign like never before. Friction with politicians is nothing new, but this was.
Like this sleazy guy right over here from ABC.
Now, having won the election, will those who think the media conspired against them be any less inclined to blame the messenger?
One Donald Trump supporters left this sign on a press table in the press pen. It shows a swastika in the word media.
An extreme example? Not really. Anti-Semitic slurs and threats were also sent to Politico reporter Hadass Gold. And then there's this image, a Trump supporter wearing a T-shirt, joking about lynching journalists, the image widely shared on social media.
No, you're here about justice, because you don't have a heart.
Against this backdrop, has being a journalist in the United States just become a more dangerous job? Hadass, let me start there. Does the job feel more dangerous to you today?
It definitely feels different and more threatening than it did a few years ago, or if you were a political journalist in any other campaign. It's definitely part of it is from the supporters of Donald Trump and those who are just fed up with the media. Journalists have been at his rallies, as you showed, they've been jeered and booed to the point that some of them have actually had to be escorted by Secret Service or police out of the rallies out of fears for their own safety. As you mentioned, I myself have been the subject of very targeted harassment online. My colleagues have received letters to their personal homes with threats. So far, none of that has come to be necessarily physical threats, but I think everybody is just waiting for that first one to happen.
Do you believe it will?
Yes.
You know, I'm wondering, with the election now behind the United States, do you think that the people who are behind these kinds of attacks will feel emboldened by the fact that Donald Trump won?
I think that they will initially. I've gotten some reassurances from some of Republican sources that I talked to who said they think it will pass. But we've already, had experiences of reporters who have been targeted. We've heard reports, for example, of the Wall Street Journal graphics editor, as she was leaving the building that actually also houses Fox News, there was a group of supporters out there celebrating the win, and they turned to her and they said that they're going to grab her genitals, the same word that Donald Trump used in that video. And that's really disheartening to hear as a reporter, because it's fine if people disagree with our reporting. I support readers who want to email me and talk about how much they disagree with my reporting or they think that I might be biased. But I think where a lot of people, and I'm sure most Trump and Clinton supporters draw the line, is when it becomes threats.
So how do you go forward? How do you now cover President-elect Donald Trump, ostensibly for the next 4 years, when there is not just friction between his supporters in the media, but between him and the media? He frankly doesn't have a lot of time for what we do.
Yeah, it's going to be probably the most difficult task of political reporting will be actually to be a White House reporter with Donald Trump. We're already experiencing that. Trump has not allowed, and this entire time, he's not allowed the media reporters to travel with him on his plane or within his motorcade, really, which means that we don't know necessarily where he is or what he's doing at any one time. The Trump team is not sending out readouts of Trump's conversations with foreign leaders. Instead, reporters are getting that information from the other foreign leaders, saying, oh, I talked to President-elect Trump today, this is what we talked about. He's breaking all norms and traditions for access. At this point, we kind of have to assume that we can't assume anything, and that there might not be a White House press pool as we used to. There might not be reporters in the White House. There might not be a daily press briefing.
It's going to be interesting to watch it all unfold. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We've never been in this boat before, and I think we didn't assume we'd be in this boat either.
As Tuesday's election results poured in, many journalists tried to make sense of an outcome they frankly did not expect.
We're covering a story that no one saw coming.
And what that outcome means for politics and for journalism.
Let's face it, we in many ways were on the ballot as well, the media.
But why the shock?
Those of us in the national media have walled ourselves off far too much from where people live.
Are journalists disconnected from the people they're supposed to serve? John, you've worked in newsrooms on both sides of the border, led the Chicago Sun-Times, the Toronto Star, and the investigations that they do as journalists. So as we all watch this, how did we get to a point where people think of journalists as them and not part of their lives?
I think we're part of the lives of about half of the population. And that was really proved out in the election in the United States. And we've seen it here too, in Canada, where there is tremendous dissatisfaction among people who are of a more conservative bent or more from the rural part of Canada with the media.
But the journalists tend to think of themselves as people who hold power to account, that we're acting on behalf of the public. And yet now we're in this space where half of the public doesn't think we have any clue what they care about.
And I think, in fact, that when you look at the coverage of this past election, it's a fair criticism. We got journalism got the context wrong for why people voted in the way that they did. The campaign was covered as if it were a plebiscite on the character of Donald Trump. But it wasn't really. It had a lot more to do with the fact that for almost half of the American population, they haven't had a raise in 40 years. Social mobility, but especially employment mobility, is almost zero in the United States now. It's the lowest in the Western world. It's far worse in the States than it is here. So you have in the States a kind of segregation too among white people, which is really interesting and really disturbing for them. That is to say, we're in a world now where powerful people marry powerful people. It is lawyers marry lawyers. We're no longer in a world where one family lifts another family up, where there is change. There is a class of creative people, and then there are those who, frankly, are not part of this globalized world.
But journalists think that they talk to people all the time. How did they miss an entire conversation? Is it because, and we know ourselves that there's been a change in the media landscape, that newsrooms have gotten smaller, especially in places like Middle America, parts of Canada as well, that we're all living on the coast now and having the conversations that take place there? That's
absolutely right, Diane. I think that's a big deal in the United States and even here. I mean, we in Canada now have a situation where there are some provincial legislatures that are virtually uncovered by permanent staff. And certainly we're not doing the kind of coverage of public corporations, of government committees, the kind of thing that we used to do to be a real watchdog. So what's happening in the States, of course, is because you've got, there continues to be staffing and budget for reporting on the coasts, coasts that are very democratic and not Republican. They don't have a sense of the heartland, and they don't have a sense of the struggles that some Americans have.
If there is, and we use this sort of number a bit loosely, but half the population who thinks that we understand what they're interested in, how do journalists win back the public trust of the other 50%?
I think they've got to, one of the things that we really have to do is go out and have a look at how life is lived. The reality in Canada is in fact different from that in the United States. We've done better in this country at giving people a sense of opportunity. There's still struggles. Globalization has still been difficult for people, but there isn't the same sense of being left behind as there is in the United States. However, we do have this problem, and you were pointing out where in fact the ability to finance coverage is now in Toronto, in Vancouver, in Montreal, but it's getting tougher and tougher everywhere else.
Thanks for your thoughts on this.
Yeah, my pleasure.
In the aftermath of Trump's victory, a financial boost for some nonprofit organizations that produce investigative journalism. ProPublica, a nonpartisan organization, saw 10 times the normal donations the day after the election. The more liberal Mother Jones and The Nation received similar boosts, a sign perhaps that some are looking to investigative journalists to hold the new administration to account. When political change turns violent, what role do journalists play?
We are political prisoners.
What Canadian Mohamed Fahmy discovered when he ended up in an Egyptian jail. My conversation with him just ahead. But first, coming to Canada?
And I'll probably have to leave the country. Where would you go? I'm going to Canada.
For months, anxious Americans have threatened to move north if the election doesn't go their way.
Canada, here I come.
It's become fodder for comedians.
Everyone's talking about moving to Canada.
And 24-hour news channels.
So, someone in Cape Breton took advantage of this opportunity that they saw and began marketing themselves, marketing Cape Breton as a place for Americans to move to.
First of all, where is Cape Breton? It's in Nova Scotia, along Canada's eastern coast.
Kudos to CNN for at least getting the geography right. Viewers of this online channel might want to refer to a map before packing up.
Go check out British Columbia.
Right, yeah, that's like in the middle of Canada. It's frigidly cold there, though.
Of course, we've heard this before.
George W. Bush's re-election, especially, there's a lot of people saying, "Oh no, if he gets elected again, I'm moving to Canada."
So when Trump did win,
Fox News is reporting that Canada's immigration website has crashed.
A huge spike in web traffic coming from the U.S. Celebrities like Snoop Dogg saying they're coming, and comedians saying what they'll do when they get here.
If I play my cards right, freeze to death.
But we think it's a little presumptive to assume that Canadians want to quadruple the population overnight. Consider this message that aired on The Ellen Show.
Hi, I'm Guy LeBleu-Blah, Secretary of the Real Canadian Bureau of Immigration, Many Americans have expressed interest in moving here. Well, to that, we Canadians say, no, leave us the out of it. Canada, we're nice, but not that nice.
Here are 5 things we learned this week from investigative journalists. A CBC News investigation showed hundreds of complaints filed to hospitals and health authorities since 2010, alleging a range of mistreatment of women in labor and delivery wards. Ontario's premier bans senior political staff from attending fundraising events after reporting by the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star raised questions about lobbyists paying for access to political officials. An insurance company does an about-face and agrees to pay the family of a 12-year-old girl who lost vision after an eye injury. It comes after a CBC Go Public story sparked strong reaction on social media. CBC's The Fifth Estate finds police in Thunder Bay, Ontario, weren't thorough in their investigation of the 2015 death of an Indigenous man, Stacey DeBungy. And an investigation by BuzzFeed finds more than 100 websites supporting Donald Trump are in fact run out of a small town in Macedonia. The teenagers running them admit to making up false headlines to get more clicks and make more money. As we saw this past week in the United States, journalists play a unique role in covering political change. But if that change turns violent, reporters can find themselves targeted in the upheaval. Canadian-Egyptian journalist Mohamed Fahmy was in that country to cover the so-called Arab Spring in 2013. But what started as a push for democracy quickly devolved into a fight for power. And Fahmy, who was the acting bureau chief for Al Jazeera English, became a pawn in the battle. He was charged with falsifying news reports, jailed with 2 colleagues, and left wondering if he would ever get out of Egypt's notorious Scorpion prison.
This court is a political case. We are political prisoners.
Even as his case made headlines around the world, the Canadian government pressured to fight for his release. He was found guilty.
And we're very happy that the President Sisi took this action and released us.
He spent more than 400 days in prison before he was ultimately released and pardoned. He's now living in Canada and has chronicled his experience in his new book, The Marriott Cell, an epic journey from Cairo's Scorpion prison to freedom. Mohamed, your book begins not with the imprisonment, but you're there witnessing this incredible upheaval, political change in Egypt. And obviously there are some profound differences, but I wonder if you had that same sense of watching change happen as we saw the U.S. election take place this week and a really pretty seismic shift in the political dynamic there.
Well, when the Arab Spring started in Egypt and the Middle East, I returned, like many Canadian and American Egyptians, hoping that we can taste true democracy there. And the youth who started the revolution were great and they were successful, but then the Muslim Brotherhood hijacked the revolution. And unfortunately, the Muslim Brotherhood won the presidency after the elections. And I do remember watching Trump win the elections just a couple of days ago, and I was so disappointed, and I felt the same helplessness that I felt when Mohamed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president, won the elections in Egypt, despite the fact that many liberals and seculars did not want the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamist group, to run and rule Egypt.
One of the things I find interesting in your book is that you talk about before your arrest, at different points, especially when you were covering the protests, feeling that there was a kind of an insular sense that journalists have, a kind of a protection. You talk about your Canadian passport, that people will see you as an impartial observer, not part of what's going on, and that journalists have that kind of an innate protection. I wonder if you think, though, that it still exists. We've heard about Canadian journalists being spied on by police. We see what's happened to journalists who've been attacked online in the United States. Is it naive for any of us now to think that we are granted some kind of distance?
Well, I do believe that we are naive if we think there is true freedom of expression anywhere in the world at the moment. I think it's, and I portray that in the book, that we are facing now the worst attack on press freedom and human rights, where journalists are not safe and have no neutral ground to operate. And what I'm seeing in Canada with the spying on 10 journalists by the police in Quebec, and what's happening in the States with the rhetoric that's coming out of Trump's mouth, it's really incredibly sad. And in my book, I also highlight the importance of networks towards their journalists to also upgrade their security assessment and the safety of their journalists. But this book is honestly my first journalistic mission. After my release, I had become the story overnight, and I had been accused of being a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, which were designated as a terrorist organization, and I am done with being the story. In this book, you'll see me conducting some interviews to highlight a little bit of what's happening in the Middle East and what Canada can do to better protect its citizens when they're abroad. So I look forward to getting some feedback from you.
It's a good book. I'll give you that feedback right off the bat. It's an interesting tale. And I wonder, too, if you feel, toward the end of the book, you talk about the people that you left behind in the prison who are still there, people who were fighting for press freedom, some of them, and very young men. What is your sense of whether this corner gets turned at some point and things get better, or do you see it only getting worse?
Well, the Scorpion prison where I was nicknamed the cemetery, and many prisoners have died there, and no one actually gets out of there, very rarely, and I was one of the lucky ones. I do say in the book that if Egypt wants to portray a more democratic position, they should free more of these young students who were caught in protests and some of the journalists in the prison. And I do hope that the government in Canada also upgrades their protection. And I wrote some of this manuscript of the book while I was in prison. And I've also written a protection charter, and I've submitted it to the government in Ottawa, hoping that the government would enshrine a new law that obligates the Canadian government to intervene when a Canadian citizen is imprisoned abroad. At the moment, we don't have it as an obligation, while the US, Germany, UK, and many other countries have it written in stone.
Well, certainly happy to be talking to you as you sit in Canada now. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
But the media now wants to go back and stir the pot.
We heard a lot of slamming the media in recent months, but could that criticism be fair? My POV just ahead. First, investigators on assignment.
I'm Dave Seglins in Ottawa. 2 years ago, an armed gunman shot and killed a soldier before forcing his way inside Parliament, where he himself was then shot and killed. Now, the Trudeau government is currently reviewing Canada's anti-terrorism legislation, and is considering new powers that would help police who say they're hitting digital roadblocks as they try to track extremists. Powers to help with uncrackable mobile devices, or encryption, or online activity that's anonymous, untraceable. But what would these new powers mean for Canadians' digital privacy? Well, CBC News and the Toronto Star next week are taking an exclusive look into the dilemmas of police and privacy.
Got a story tip for the investigators? Share it anonymously at securedrop.cbc.ca. You can also contact us through email. That's investigators@cbc.ca. Or just say hi to us on Twitter @Swain Diana. You're watching The Investigators on CBC News Network.
Could you please inform Andy Bernard that he is being shunned?
Andy, Dwight says welcome back, and he could use a hug.
Okay, tell him that that's not true.
Does that scene from The Office remind you of where you work? A lot of workplaces are like that. Never mind agreeing with each other all the time, you might not even like each other that much. Newsrooms are no different, but it's never been more clear that reporters, whose job it is to report back to you, are seen by many as all having exactly the same worldview, and one that is wildly out of touch.
And the elite media in newsroom after newsroom is dedicated to defeating Trump.
Reflecting on the U.S. election results, it's clear many journalists were consumed by topics and truths that many voters simply were not. Trump didn't pay his taxes, we said. Did he break the law? Some voters asked. Well, no, we said. So what's the problem, they asked.
This is like badgering. In other words, I don't see it as journalism, I see it as badgering.
So we leave you with a couple of thoughts. The investigative journalism done during the campaign was good work. People saw it, they read it, and they made their choice. It was democracy in action. But the fact that startlingly few journalists predicted Trump would win, or even understood what millions of voters clearly cared about, suggests there is a problem. And journalists need to ask themselves now why it is that so many people think of us as not representing them. In the wee hours of Wednesday morning, that was an unmistakable wake-up call. I'm Diana Swain. This is The Investigators.